On behalf of our team at HBK, I'd like to welcome you to the Future of Cannabis Cultivation Operations and Costing with Chris Marrie, Principal and Director of HBK Cannabis Solutions, and Warren Harasz, Vice President of Compliance at Cannaspire. Our session is scheduled for 60 minutes and is being recorded. Please note that all attendees are set up in listen-only mode. If you'd like to submit a question to our panel, please use the question box in the GoToWebinar control bar. At the end of the session, you'll be prompted to complete a survey and provide us with feedback on the webinar. For more information and insights, please visit our Cannabis section of our Insights page at hbkpka.com/insights. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making the time to be with us this morning. I'm really excited to have this discussion with Warren Harasz, who I just love sitting and talking about all aspects of the industry with. Always exciting conversation, and we're looking forward to kind of talking through the value of your general costing when it comes to cultivation in the cannabis industry. Thought we'd kind of start talking about some of the businesses that are going through the licensing process, or they've been awarded licenses but are pre-revenue, and just some of the things that are critical for them from an operational standpoint. And then we'll talk a little bit about how the cost accounting and those decisions even play in very early on. Warren, do you want to maybe give us an idea of what you're seeing in the licensing process and what is critical for people that are going through it and looking to be awarded licenses in the cultivation space?
Yeah, so really it comes down to location, right? So especially in states like New Jersey, who is, the most active right now in terms of licensing on the East Coast at least, you're just seeing that it's really huge to be in with the municipality. So this means that any cultivators need to already start attending city council meetings. They need to start agitating for the municipal management to know where it is that they're going to be located, because if you can't get that municipal verification, licensing is out of the question.
Absolutely, and it's also important to remember, a lot of times, unfortunately, in the cannabis space, these can be sunk costs. They're costs that you're probably not going to get a tax deduction for, at least not a significant tax deduction for. So as important as it is, you have to accept kind of going in that these are costs you're going to have to accept without any benefit on the back end. I think the other thing that we're really seeing in the pre-revenue, or sort of the, once you're licensed space, is there was a court case a couple weeks ago. And when we talk about cost accounting, there's sort of two components of it in cannabis. It's just good general business practices. Without costing, how do you really run any business? And that applies to any manufacturing, agriculture business, whatever space you're in. The nuance in cannabis is, because of the income tax law, you can only deduct your cost of goods sold. So we sort of have a two-pronged decision here that's very important from the outset. And one of the things that the IRS came out with a couple weeks ago is they're saying now you have to use basically generally accepted accounting principles right out of the gate in order to qualify for what they think is full absorption costing. If you don't make these decisions early on when you're picking this location and deciding what you're going to do, you're going to be playing catch up later. So I think it's become all that much more important. And, Warren, from your standpoint, how are these decisions impacted on what type of cultivation and what type of process you're going to have as you move forward through this phase of the life of the business?
Right. So, ultimately, I've seen some people under guidance from HBK, no less, try to strategize some agricultural plans for their business initially, so that they can stay out of the plant touching side of things for as long as possible until they are licensed and ready to immediately open up operations. It also plays into what type of facility you're going to be building, right? So if you're doing indoor cultivation, that cost is going to be something where you really need something fresh and new, versus, outdoor, you can start very small and sort of build your way up at a lower cost. I'm not sure if that's hitting at the point of your question there, Chris. Do you want to maybe reposition that for me?
Sure. So, just kind of thinking through this, how much difference is there between the different types of cultivation you might decide to do in terms of what cost centers you have to be cognizant of? So, if you decide to do, indoor, you're going to grow flower to sell as, high-end flower versus maybe something that you're going to grow more for extraction or sell in mass quantities. How much different would your costing structure be, and how much more challenge would you have in maybe tracking some of that depending on what decision you make?
Yeah, I mean, how you cultivate it really has a big impact upon what that cost life cycle is going to look like, right? So, for instance, you're seeing New York State trying to convert hemp CBD farms into cannabis cultivation licenses right now. This is a pretty cheap startup for, somebody that already has a hemp CBD license. Ideally, they probably already have some fencing in place. So from there, it's just about like security costs. And then, of course, the state required seed to sale tracking through Metric. You could probably get that outdoor product up and running for, $100,000 just to secure your area and start tagging and tracking everything. But of course, you need quality more than anything. You need labor to run all of that. And then at the end of the day, you need some sort of marketing play, right? Which is what you were talking about. Do you just take the bulk flower and pass it to a manufacturer, saving you the costs of employee labor to trim it, get it packaged, get all of those things ready? Or are you actually going to spend that time, to up your final retail price that you take to the dispensary to try and process? Whereas indoor cultivation, pretty much you either are going to fresh freeze it and take it to the manufacturer, or you're going to package it up because you want to try to get that top shelf dollar and increase your marketability. So indoor, it's a much trickier costing analysis, right? Because it's just a lot more moving pieces through that facility. So really how you cultivate it is going to majorly impact how you're going to start tracking these things. And really, you probably know this, Chris, but seed to sale software is not going to do this for you, okay? I've often said that I feel like, BioTrack and Metric, kind of their strategy is to overwhelm the regulators with a vast amount of data. So great, all your biomass is in there, all of your plant tags and plant counts are in there. But in terms of running your business, how much yield per strain, how much yield per square foot, yield per watt, cost per gram, none of that is going to come out in that seed to sale tracking. So this is really where you just have to have a very clear idea of what your production cost is, what your labor cost is, and then ultimately what that startup and build out costs you to try to pay all of that off. So
no, absolutely. That's great. And kind of to even build on that a little bit more, I think one of the things we see a lot in the startup phase, this is particularly, I think, relevant to indoor cultivation because of the, like you mentioned, the additional costs that it really takes to get that ramped up. As you're starting to build up your indoor cultivation, I think, people generally will think of the direct costs right away, the labor, the direct inputs into that. However, the indirect costs, the overhead of that facility, as you're ramping it up and getting it to full capacity, that contribution margin is a cost. And a lot of times I think people don't think of that, and they end up with an inflated gross profit percentage over what they're really getting. Have you seen that kind of in your experience? And, what have you kind of done to try to combat that as a professional cultivator?
Yeah, so what I always tell people is it's much better to under promise and over deliver than to do the reverse, right? So quite often when cultivators, they want to put their strongest, case for their business model to investors and, the licensing bodies and all of that. But if you're claiming 3.5 pounds per light, and then you fall short of that in your first 2 or 3 harvests, you're off to a bad start and your annual average is completely dinged at that point. So it's much better to start with, a reasonable 2.5 pounds per light. Again, this is indoor. There are so many different ways of production, but just making that square footage as productive as possible, right? Without overestimating what it would actually cost. And then you really need to think about the entire life cycle of the plant, right? So that includes mother plant maintenance, the time it took for your crew to clone those mother plants, tagging, defoliation, even CO2, right? So say you have one giant tank outside the building, it's feeding, 4 cultivation rooms. You need to figure out what percentage each one of those rooms is using of your, regularly scheduled CO2 deliveries, and try to cost that in over the life cycle of the plant, right? Ultimately, you should have an entire life cycle, 60 or 70 days through the harvest, plus whatever time it took for you to produce those clones to fill the room in veg, then labor for the flip, right? The cleaning, maintenance. This is to your point, Chris, is that their lights burn out, HVAC units go out, especially when you first build the facility. Nothing is optimized. We were operating in the island of Hawaii, and just you can't possibly quantify how humid or hot that is. And you do your first harvest and you realize, holy cow, we need another 4 dehumidifiers in that room. So it is impacting your harvest, especially in those first 2 or 3 runs as you're dialing in the space. And you need to anticipate that startup cost of what you're going to have to put in to optimize and get towards that projection, so that you're not, over promising and under delivering.
And I think that's such a great point when it comes to, projections, whether they're for investors, internal use, whatever they're for, is making them realistic. There's always that tendency to make it as rosy as possible, and everyone wants to be an optimist when you're starting out. There's nothing wrong with optimism. At the same time, we want to be realistic, as you said. We don't want to overpromise and underdeliver to investors or to anyone else. Is it generally fair to say that for any new cultivation facility, there's going to be some period of trial and error where you're going to have higher costs in order to develop the quality that you want? And in your experience, what's a realistic expectation for that time? Is it multiple harvests? What does it take to dial something like that in?
I mean, it's really a team building exercise, right? So if you build a beautiful facility and you're constantly having high turnover and replacing your directors of cultivation or master growers, no one knows what's happening from one harvest to the other. This is where a savvy facility operator, your CEOs and COOs, if you are taking enough facility data, and this takes technology to do that, right? Root zone sensors, automated fertigation, automated irrigation, lighting on light controllers. You should have all of this data tracked very carefully, so that if for some reason your master grower turns out he's not as great as you thought he was and you need to replace him, you at least have a model for what went wrong in that room, and sort of why. So to your point, it takes oftentimes 2 or 3 harvests, especially indoor, to dial the indoor space. You can see the same thing in greenhouses. We tried to shift our strains in a greenhouse in Sonoma County, and it took about 2 runs to get the new Granddaddy Purple to acclimate to our climate in that area. So it's all about balancing what the market demands with what you can produce in terms of quality, and then what's realistic in terms of labor, and what your team can actively deliver, right? So it's really, like I said, a team building exercise. You want somebody that's going to work with you and learn from all of these metrics and data, and then improve and be able to understand what went wrong and what went right. So, yeah.
It sounds like if you're not tracking this and then actually quantifying it, so what did it cost for you to get the Granddaddy Purple to acclimate to your current facility? If you're not tracking that and costing it, you can't really make good business decisions at that point, for example, on what genetics you should be running on where you're at. You know, would it be cost prohibitive maybe to have certain types of genetics versus others? And if you're not tracking that, how do you really make those business decisions in a timely manner without sinking a bunch of money into maybe something that wasn't worth it?
I mean, that's exactly it, right? So, you know, just to follow up with that example, right? We had a greenhouse full of Blue Dream. Everyone in Sonoma County had that same cut of Blue Dream. It was worth maybe $1,200 a pound because of how, you know, flooded the market was with that. So the first run of the Granddaddy Purple, it was a loss, big time. It did not produce, it wasn't properly put in, but the Granddaddy Purple would go at $1,800 a pound. So flash forward 2 harvests later, it is yielding the equivalent of the Blue Dream, and it's worth that extra 600, you know, almost 30% price increase, right? So that 30% is that profit margin that paid for the cost of those 2 poor harvests, right? And so, like you said, Chris, if you're not tracking any of this stuff, you're blind. And ultimately, all of these facility operators should look at their market data as their most valuable asset, because whether you want to expand, whether you need to hire or fire, so often we see a key man issue with these master growers, right? They've been on the traditional market forever, and they think that their secret recipe, their secret genetics, however it is they're handling it or they're doing it, is just the best, most valuable product in the world. And some of them are totally worth it, right? But that being said, what happens when that guy gets in a car accident and suddenly your magic man is gone and you haven't been tracking all of these metrics, and your next couple harvests are going to suffer while you're trying to figure out what this guy was doing in your facility? So ultimately, data is everything. And like I said, the seed to sale is not going to track it for you, right? You really need to partner with an HBK that's going to come in with the spreadsheets, help build out the equations, talk to your laborers, figure out where your labor cost is, and track those plants all the way through from mother to harvest.
Yeah, and I think that's still one of the challenges that the industry really has, is there really are no good IT solutions that assist with this process. The seed to sale, you know, it's funny, if you really think about how they're set up, it's almost like the regulators are their client, not the operator. And so, you know, they're very, let's say, slow to take feedback from people actually using their software. And on top of that, it doesn't really do costing. You can enter it, but you have to calculate it. So a lot of this is still being done outside of the integrated IT environment. You're doing it in Excel, and it can be tedious. And with that, it's got to be, you know, good information going in, and it's time consuming sometimes to gather that. So I think a lot of times people don't invest and they pay a price for it later, kind of like we're talking about now.
Well, and there are some potential ways to track, right? Especially with these modern indoor facilities and their magnetic door locks. So every time somebody enters or leaves a cultivation room, they're swiping that key card to get in and out. This is where having your facility set up with SOPs, handbooks, operating procedures, and policies, you can actually send an employee in and say, hey, cultivation technician 1, I need you to go and defoliate flower room A. Cultivation technician 2, I need you to go set up trellising in flower room B. Then you can compare how much time the laborer was taking in there. And usually one of your managers can also fill out a checklist or audit form to make sure that the job was done to satisfaction. The last thing you want is you send the guy in to do the job and then you come back and it's only half defoliated and you still have, you know, another half day of work when time is of the essence with these crops, right? So this is where you can start, you know, getting a realistic, in the course of a harvest, how many cultivation techs hours did we use? How many bottles of nutrients? How many deliveries of CO2? How many lights burnt out and we replaced? What was our electric and water bill? And then you start getting realistic, you know, price of pound production on down to the cost per gram.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's one of those things, if you set this up from your first, you know, from day one, when you put your first plants in the ground, the big lift is always doing it the first time. So that's going to be the most time consuming. That's going to be the most challenging. Once it's done the first time, we can just build on it from there, and it becomes less time consuming. And then we have very good documentation about the costing structure and exactly what you're talking about. I think one of the other things that people tend to forget or not realize, these are good business practices, period. This is how you develop, you know, key performance indicators and really understand that your costing structure. On top of that, it's risk mitigation. In the cannabis industry, we always say, and it's a joke, but it's not. It's not if you're going to be audited by the IRS, it's when. And one of the biggest things that they've been successful in really winning a lot of their positions on audits and assessing cannabis businesses is just lack of documentation. And to your point, all of this information is available. It's just a matter of accumulating it and documenting it and making sure that we have these time studies and these things in place if anyone were to ever question or challenge what we're doing. And kind of along those lines, as you move then out of the startup space and into, you know, a fully functional facility, what in your experience has been the biggest challenge of getting the businesses to really embrace this costing in real time from the start?
So it's usually what I described, where these companies, especially when they're in startup mode, they will do anything and pay whatever it takes to get a successful harvest and get that first dollar coming in. Now, the industry is inundated with expert master growers from the traditional market. You do see a bit of a high turnover, especially at the beginning of facility operations, because you're trying to, you know, figure out even if your director of cultivation or master grower can even keep up. So really the biggest problem is when somebody steps out of the managerial position, what do you do? How do you prevent a lapse in production at that point, right? So really, it's having these procedures, SOPs, having some sort of process in place off the bat, so that, and really pressing your, you know, your master growers and directors of cultivation to help develop this as part of their job. And, you know, if they're uncomfortable presenting you with their secret formula or their secret recipe, they might not be the one that you want, because that's not the way to run a successful business.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It sounds almost like a circular computation to a degree. The capital requirements to start cultivation are extensive. Takes a lot of money to get going. You're kind of hampered by the income tax structure, so cash flow is always tight. You can't invest in, you know, a large number of people, so business continuity and just, you know, to your point, getting harvested product that you can actually sell is mission critical. Sometimes it's fair to say that these types of SOPs and developing them fall by the wayside because everything else is such an emergency. However, if you were to do this from day one, you probably alleviate some of the pressure of potentially having huge business interruption because you lose a key person.
So all of the investors are worried with crop success, right? And so you mentioned things like SOPs and, you know, operating procedures, checklists, forms, and audits, and they start to cringe. They go, oh, that's just noise. Right now, I need, you know, my master cultivator to solely be focused on producing a successful crop. Well, that's great, but, you know, like I said, what happens when he gets in a car wreck and you've lost your magic man? And now you're scrambling. You know, this is one of the #1 questions I get asked by people in startup. Where am I going to find growers for this facility, right? It's not like a lot of these people have resumes on LinkedIn showing their illegal, you know, basement or, you know, warehouse operations. So there's definitely a skills gap in the industry, right? Where there are these people that know how to do it, but they don't have the professional resumes. So this is really where, when I wear my consultant hat, I'm trying to work with these, cultivators to help them understand that, look, this is going to be a job. You're not going to be the business owner who is basically, almost the vertical licensee on the traditional market. Instead, you're going to be an employee, but hang on, you'll learn how to run a 50 to 100 light facility. And as the, industry advances, you might be in a position to finally move on and go and start your own company if you're as great as you say, or, you're going to figure out that it's a lot of work and the margins are slim, and, agriculture can often be a tight and difficult, labor intensive, and maybe you were happier doing things the way you did, but you definitely just want to have a realistic appraisal of what you can actually get out of this industry.
And that's such a great point. And I always, wonder, and this is why to me it's so important to start off from day one developing these types of SOPs, cost pools, and costing allocations. Is it fair to say when you're bringing people who have these skill sets to the facility but have never worked in a business of this size, they don't understand the amount of overhead that also comes with a business that size. So in their mind, they think they understand the cost. But at the end of the day, if you really sat and walked through everything that's actually going on and all the overhead that facility is pulling into their cultivation process, there's a disconnect between what they think it costs and what it actually costs.
Yeah, I would say that's realistic, because on the black market, the traditional market, none of us have these licensing fees. None of us are buying, properties outright and building, steel cold frame buildings on them brand new. When consulting cultivators, oftentimes they ask me, should I build out or should I retrofit? Ideally, you should build out because it's a purpose-built building. There are plenty of buildings that can be retrofitted, but by the time you're done retrofitting, steel insulated metal panels, sealed agricultural spaces, 270-volt service for all of your lighting, it's almost as much as if you would have built it out, right? So, and this is exactly to your point, Chris, that just these cultivators from the traditional market do not understand the project costs. Oftentimes they haven't purchased real estate, they haven't had to build out. What I always tell people is when you make your spreadsheet with all of your lights, your grow gear, trays, everything you need, take that number and double it. Whatever you think it's going to be, multiply it by 2, because then you have to install all of it, you have to maintain all of it, and you have to get it all working and operational in the building. And that's where I see the biggest push right before operational opening, is that trying to bridge that gap between a built out facility that's licensed and ready to go with an actual operational facility that's not going to have crop loss or that's missing important, aspects of what it needs.
Absolutely. And even just having the number of employees that you're going to have, this is, to your point, labor intensive. You're going to have a lot of employees, and understanding not just, what do they cost in terms of compensation, but understanding things like labor burden. We're going to have payroll taxes and benefits, and these are all things that you probably never have to deal with in the traditional market environment. And if you don't think of those things from the beginning, you don't really understand all of the costs that are going into producing 1 gram of flower to be sold. And so, I feel like a lot of times when we go through this process, and we can talk a little bit about how the process of gathering all this data works, but we have to go through this several times to really gather all the data, because there's a huge disconnect from the people that do the work and they understand the process, they can tell you all about it, but understanding the costing and where every turn we take costs us a little bit more money, there's always a little bit of a disconnect there. So I feel like it's something we have to do multiple times to really come to a meeting of the minds. Did we really get all of our costs into this pool?
It's a really tricky negotiation to where you're trying to decide where the best spots to spend a nickel to save a dime are, right? Versus, look, you've just spent however much on building out this facility, you've tapped everything that your investors have given you, and you're starting to run out of rope, right? So there's sort of a point at which you have to figure out, one of the hidden costs is often labor, just like you were saying, right? So if I were to do cocoa core on drip, well, if I'm filling 3-gallon rose buckets, I'm having to mix that cocoa core and sit there and fill out, 1,000 or 2,000 buckets for 100 light room. That takes 4 laborers 4 or 5 days to get those 1,000 buckets filled. This is a few hundred pounds of cocoa core that you're shifting around. Whereas you could do Grodan blocks, or they do make cocoa blocks that are stackable. This would save you 4 days, but they're more expensive. You're going to spend more on the grow media. So the question is, can you afford to spend a little more on a more expensive grow media that's going to save you those 4 days of laborer's time? Or are you so pressed on startup capital that at this point it's better to just try to burn labor and tread water? Look, from the accounting side, I always say spend the nickel, save the dime, right? That cost is gonna come back to you in the long run, but ultimately it's got to be a team decision. What can you handle? In Hawaii, we had a bunch of agricultural workers that had, come on from working in tomatoes and banana farming. They were pretty affordable labor and they could handle the difficulty of the work. So our facility being as big as we were, it was better to just burn the labor and get to work at that point. And I think at this point, they've finally, mitigated and shifted strategies because they've produced a few harvests to where they can actually afford the labor saving strategy. So it's a balance. It's a negotiation between how much you have and what you can actually get done with your operations.
Absolutely. And, that's the type of decision that you can't make if you aren't proactively tracking these costs. And, if you don't have that data and you're not analyzing it, you can't make that decision. So what happens is people generally then will just default to what they've been doing and maybe miss an opportunity to save money or miss an opportunity to adjust their price because their costs are higher than they really thought they were. Understanding those inputs, the throughputs, and the outputs are so critical. One of the things that I've heard from a lot of cultivators and I've heard in facilities before that they struggle with, and I think this would probably be true in a lot of agricultural endeavors. When it comes to cultivation, the inputs and the throughputs, they always feel are very traceable. However, you never have a guaranteed output. I think people are pretty good. You see, they get pretty good at dialing it in and trying to understand. But to that point, how big of a difference can genetics make in how the inputs and throughputs are impacted from a costing standpoint? Like, are some genetics just way more expensive than others?
Yeah, it really depends, right? Because you could have the most productive plant in the world, the Blue Dream in the Sonoma County greenhouse, right? It was an incredible yielder and the market was flooded with it. The demand for that product was very, very low. So, you're getting $1,200 a pound, whereas you could have been getting $1,800 a pound for the Granddaddy Purple because it's prettier and it's more desired on the market. So to the cost of the strains, what does the market want, right? At the end of the day, if you have a Blue Dream that produces really well, but you can't sell any of it, you may as well have, 100 pounds of hay sitting on your shelves. Whereas, if you have a strain that is so desirable that it's always going to fly off the shelf, or, maybe manufacturers are aware that, wow, this one really dumps oil and it's perfect for hash production, that you've got a niche in the market to where you're going to continually keep recovering cost. And this is the biggest thing for all growers, is to get that harvest moved and move on to your next one. So this is where, wholesaler distributors are probably going to come into the picture big time, because you're going to save me $100 to $200 a pound to trim and package something into eighths and quarters, whereas I can just focus on getting back in the grow room and producing a successful crop, and then let the distributors package it all up and take it out to the dispensary and get working. So you're going to also take a per pound hit on that. So are certain genetics more profitable? Absolutely. It's almost a flavor game, Chris, to where, and all of the traditional market growers know this. They're continuously popping new seeds. They're continuously trading genetics and strains. It's a market. You have to diversify. You do not want to do the same strain forever. I don't care how magical or special that strain is. Eventually people will burn out on it. So it's a process of finding where your niche is and what is desirable on the market, versus what's going to really produce and be of good quality. Blue Dream, it always produces, it's always good quality, but you can't sell it. So,
and that's, kind of spot on to what I was going to mention next. And I think it's so important that you can get your cost accounting down to a SKU level. If you can really get there, and I know it's challenging, especially on cultivation, but if you really invest the time, again, this is how you can make sound business decisions. Knowing what your cost of different genetics are and your return on that investment based on market demand, if you can track that and see profitability by strain, you can maximize the value of your facility. But it is difficult to get there. And two of the areas that we consistently see people struggle are labor studies and equipment usage. And I think that the big challenge there is everyone's pretty good about getting kind of the high level, this is how many people we needed, this is what they did, but they don't factor in a couple different things. There's always, something goes wrong and we have some sort of remediation process, or there's little things along the way that generally the people who understand the process think are immaterial, but they add up. And then just generally understanding equipment usage versus capacity is something that we still see facilities kind of really struggle to get their arms around, and what various pieces of equipment they use. Is that something that you're seeing kind of people getting more comfortable with tracking, or is that still a pain point sort of for the industry?
I mean, it's all manual tracking at this point. I do see some really nice like Mango Tech sensors that are coming out. So if it were me, I would want, light meters dispersed through my canopy. I'm going to want to know, roughly what my light percentages are, per week. So it's not just like you're burning a 1200 or 800 watt LED, the entire intensity through. You're going to dial it up slowly through, the bloom process. So how many watts are you using? What is that PPFD light intensity output reading? Really, I'd like to know daily. Because certain strains, maybe you have a sativa that has a landrace quality. It loves that hot sun. It loves it a little more humid. It's going to do really well with a little bit higher photon output. Whereas something like an OG Kush is a little more delicate. You could really fry it on the front end of that harvest. And the next thing you know, you're going, oh, geez, I cooked my delicate top shelf strain, right? So what I would say is it's, figuring out root zone sensors also. A lot of these nutrient feeds, they're getting it down to just like 150 milliliter shots of nutrients given multiple times throughout the day. And you've got graphs that it'll output that'll show you sort of where the nutrient uptake is. You want to really know day by day a full grow journal of light intensity, vapor pressure deficit, humidity, heat, all of it, because it only takes one day of your lighting being off and too much humidity, and you stressed out all of that entire tray, and now you've got seeds all throughout that tray, and you can't sell it as, smokable flower. At best, you could remediate it and give it to a manufacturer and see if they can do something with it. But you've lost a ton of value. So ultimately, it really comes down to, how tightly are you parameterizing this stuff, and have you put into place processes with your employees to check every single day and create journals. And the better tracked this journal is, the more close to reality that cost per gram, that SKU number cost is actually going to be. And you can see, oh man, I can't grow the sour tangy anymore. I'm taking a loss. It's not yielding right. It's not flying off the shelf fast enough. But, you know, the Josh Dog OG is, you know, is in incredible demand, and it's beautiful every time it comes out of the room.
And that's, you know, I think sometimes where we miss the boat a little bit. If you look at traditionally what we'd seen in the industry is, call it a historical or hindsight type of costing, where at the end of the year, you know, the cost pool's been developed and it's accurate for financial reporting purposes. It's accurate. You know what all the costs are. Now we have the numbers. You go back and you look at, you know, what the total, you know, production was for the facility. You can figure out the cost per gram in hindsight. But when we talk about moving away from just making business decisions on which SKUs we should cultivate and sell, you know, those types of decisions, the decisions that need to be made to improve the process get missed when you do it that way. And so if we're proactively costing, when we look at our monthly financial statements, if we develop a standard cost, we're going to have variances. So we could have a labor variance based on what we actually incurred in labor and what we expected to incur based on our standard costing. Or same thing with equipment. We can identify the inefficiencies. Maybe we have certain employees or teams that are less efficient than others. Maybe we're having problems in certain areas where we could, you know, button it up or make process improvements. Or we could also maybe see that, you know what, our costing is a little outdated because we haven't updated it for 6 months, and maybe our facilities changed and we have to go back and kind of revisit that and see where we're at. And I think those types of real-time decisions where you can improve the production process and save money right then and there can be missed if we're not doing these types of analysis proactively.
I mean, these facilities are beehives, right? So employees are constantly calling out sick, light fixtures are burning out, AC units are going down. You know, worst case scenario, there could be potential contamination. Really, if you have some sort of clean room protocols and good sanitation in place from the beginning, that shouldn't be an issue. But, you know, these are the types of problems that people see. So it's really about taking that micro level, day to day, track daily, you know, have somebody go in, stand up on a ladder and look across the entire canopy to look for anything wilting. Go site by site and check for pests and make sure that your IPM is correctly in place. You know, it takes, these facilities can cost $1 million or more for even a small one. You're not going to put an inexperienced driver behind the wheel of your F-150 race car, right? So make sure that you've got somebody that really knows how to get off to the races and is willing to work with you to sort of track all of these things, because seriously, like you said, Chris, you might change a strain, you know, from harvest 1 to harvest 2 in a room, and it makes all the difference in the world, or it causes all the problems. And yeah, at the end of the year, you could break this all down and do an average, but what you really want is the harvest to harvest data, you know, so that you can actually get a sense for what was working and what wasn't, and start to dial in on where quality actually exists and what your operating procedures.
And I could see, you know, someone who's in the industry listening to this and saying, this all sounds great, but when they look at what's on their plate every day and everything that they have to deal with, taking the time to do this probably seems very, very challenging and just something that they just don't have time to address. So coming from that position yourself, like, how do you balance that? You know, again, it sounds like something that the accountants are saying that sounds great in a textbook, but you just don't understand what it's really like to have to deal with this. What's your kind of thoughts on that?
I mean, the master growers and the people managing and directing these facilities have a big job. And, you know, I just remember back in Hawaii, especially in initial operations, people would say, oh, that's just noise. This is all just noise. You're distracting me from the actual goal of producing a successful harvest and making sure that we're returning our investment, right? Now, that being said, if something goes wrong in that process and you lose out on that investment, if some of the crop gets, seeded or molded and you can't sell it, then suddenly you're really wishing that you knew what had gone wrong, right? So it's a contingency. It's demonstrating to your investors. And I would say, look, if you don't have time or bandwidth with your operators, this is where hiring a set of consultants to come in, write your facility SOPs, talk to your operators, help them develop what it is that they're actually doing on the day-to-day, and then make it fit in a way that's going to make sense, that's not overly cumbersome for them to run their business with. So this is what I say is I've actually worked in these facilities. I speak operator, right? So I can usually help hone in on what it is that's missing in a labor process or where inefficiencies are starting to occur, and help take this off of your master cultivator's plate, because he's busy dialing nutrient feeds, figuring out breeding schedules, harvest schedules. He's trying to set up all of your production. It's a lot of moving pieces. So then get your accountants involved, right? Have us come in, do your operating procedures, develop checklists for all of these things I'm talking about, so that you're tracking light intensity, vapor pressure deficit, humidity, all of these things day to day. And then, bring your accountant in and start analyzing, bring in that micro level, develop these spreadsheets so that you have a really efficient costing process.
Absolutely, and I will freely admit there's a component of this that is going to be a little bit annoying and time consuming and feel like busy work to an operator. The way I would look at it is it's an investment, and my hope would be is that by spending time with us, we could give you data that is going to allow you at some point to correct a problem before it costs you a whole bunch of money. For example, let's say you have labor inefficiencies that are costing you $15,000 a month. If you can identify that the first month or even the second month, rather than after it happened for a year straight, it was worth the time that we spent together. And then again, the lift initially is the big lift, and that's going to be the most time consuming component. Once that's done and we're all comfortable with what we've built, now all we're doing is making changes to it as the business or the industry changes. You have a new product that's coming on, or one of the things that we're talking today about cultivation, if you move into, which most or a lot of these businesses at least aim to do, they move into, even if it's not fully vertically integrated, but they're going to start manufacturing. If you aren't ahead of this before you start manufacturing, you're going to have a really, really difficult time, because then we're coming into true, hardcore manufacturing type cost accounting. And if you don't have it dialed in, that becomes very, very difficult, especially with the number of SKUs that they can put out through the manufacturing process.
Well, and we have a saying in manufacturing for the cannabis industry, right? It's quality in, quality out. So the quality of that cultivation is ultimately going to dictate what is the quality of your manufactured product at the end. And so all of these things we're talking about are quality management, quality assurance procedures. It may seem like a big cost, but at the same time, how much is it going to cost you if you have a crop failure? How much is it going to cost you if, like you said, you've been running with labor inefficiencies for an entire year and you don't even know? From the high level, you're just setting, employees loose in your facility and saying, oh, this is what it costs, but you haven't even analyzed, could it be done better? Or is there something happening in this process that's preventing us from reaching our quality goals?
And I don't know if you would agree with this statement, but I feel like even 5 years ago, it was much more difficult to have these conversations with operators. I feel like now there's really a change in the industry where they're embracing this and really looking for more ideas on how they can start to dial this in and really button up their business practices. Do you think that's fair?
I would actually, and I would say the industry is evolving so very quickly. Cultivation techniques can change every 6 months. If you've been out of a facility for even a year, it's almost like a dog year at that point. You've been out for a really, really long time. So you want to track everything because you don't know when the newest, latest light is going to come out and absolutely revolutionize your process. There are better nutrients that have just recently come out. You're having less pumps burn out from clogging. You have to stay on top of that tech. And unless you're tracking what's going wrong with what you have, you're just going to assume that you're already at the best and the top versus going, oh, it would cost me, you know, $150,000 to replace all my lighting with LEDs. And you know what? I'm producing top shelf quality product right now. It just doesn't even make sense to make that investment when I don't absolutely need it. So tracking is going to be the way that these cultivators stay current on the most, up-to-date practices and don't get left behind, by somebody that can produce better quality and a higher yield.
No, that's great. I think that was pretty much most of the kind of questions or thoughts that I had. Warren, did you have any other additional points?
So, really just harping on what we've been getting at, right? Start early because your first couple of harvests aren't going to be perfect. I don't care whether you've been a legacy operator that's done this a million times. You're doing it now in front of cameras. You're doing it now with, record keeping for waste disposal and sanitation. You have to keep that compliance above board, and it's a different process from what you used to do when you could just do anything you wanted at any time of the day, right? So, tracking is going to be essential to being able to keep up with that change in terms of how we operated as traditional cultivators to those of us now, getting into the legal industry.
And I will say, we've talked about, making the time investment to get this done. I will say that we have the experience to where I think it's probably not as invasive as a process as it maybe would feel like when you start. Especially if you do it from the very beginning, it's going to be much easier. If you're in a position where you're at the very least putting together your cost pools at the end of the year and doing inventory costing analysis so you understand the process, that makes it much easier as well. But even if you're in a position where you haven't done any of this in the past, with a little bit of a time investment on the front, just spending time with a team like this and letting us understand what you're doing and helping you identify all your costs, it's not as time consuming as it sounds. And once it's done, the maintenance of it can be pretty minimal and give you good information on a real-time, ongoing basis. So I do think it's a really worthy investment to make.
I mean, ideally, you could have all of these forms and checklists on an iPad, and it's as simple as having a manager walk through each one of these rooms, check off, take down the data, and you've got a beautiful grow journal that can be used to cost harvest by harvest, batch by batch.
I'm not sure if we had any questions or if there are any questions at this point.
Yes, we did get questions that were submitted. The first one that we have received is, how is the carbon footprint of these facilities being taken into consideration?
Yeah, so that's an environmental impact question. This is something that's starting to be more and more scrutinized by the state. Ultimately, your environmental impact plan for your application is part of your compliance document to the state. So don't make any promises to install solar panels or, to do any of these sustainable practices unless you intend to have it in when the state comes through to inspect. That being said, there is a movement towards LED fixtures. If anything, just because they have a lower rate of replacement, you're replacing less light fixtures. Solar, water, in Hawaii, we actually had, hydroelectric, and it was pretty much the only hydroelectric cultivation facility in the state. Also, the grow media you use, right? So if you're using Grodan, rock wool, it's not really very environmentally friendly. It's non-compostable. It doesn't break down. So if you use cocoa coir or organic living soil, that's another way that you could potentially, reduce, reuse, recycle, and mitigate those costs. And then the last thing I'll say is packaging. New Jersey's putting an emphasis for cultivators to try to use compostable or recyclable packaging. So, every step of the process, try and lower that carbon footprint, because cultivation facilities are incredibly, energy intensive. And anything you can do to work with local facilities companies, Energy Star rated appliances, all of that stuff, again, it's going to save you money in the long run, to wire up all your lights for 270-volt service than to just, install what you have right away and then move on with a higher electric bill.
And is it fair to say that's becoming an increasing focus in the licensing process, what you're doing to minimize that?
I mean, we just talked to a farm in California, and the amount of stress that they put on water reclamation from, HVAC units and dehumidifiers, filtering and reusing agricultural runoff. The West is in a huge drought right now. They're incredibly concerned with being water savvy and not having their facility just look like a major power burn, just so that they can make a buck and a profit. So it's really important, actually, and it's definitely getting more and more scrutinized by the state. Both New York and New Jersey are requiring environmental impact plans with the application.
Okay, Lori, you said we had 2 more questions?
Yeah, the next question is it true businesses can deduct indirect costs if they use accrual method of accounting?
So really what they need to use is what we would call full absorption costing. And that would be GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles, call it GAAP compliant accounting. The difference between cannabis and a lot of other industries, a lot of industries use some hybrid of accrual accounting that may not necessarily be GAAP until they have to do financial reporting. The IRS has been adamant that if you want to get your deductions for your overhead and your indirect costs, you have to use full absorption GAAP accounting on your cost of goods sold. So if you do that, you can absolutely get those deductions. Where you run into limitations, things that are available to other businesses, like some types of accelerated depreciation, you can't use because your tax return has to match your books. So we can get benefits, we can get better deductions, and that's why we want to make sure that from day one, we're building out a costing system that's GAAP compliant. And what we're talking about here today would meet those criteria.
I think we have time for one more question. The last question is, can you please provide a rough estimate or approximate cost to build out an indoor grow in New Jersey for a micro business, maximum 2,500 square feet? Is $1 million accurate for such a building, materials, and labor?
So yeah, that's a great question, actually. Location, location, location. Are you trying to buy a parcel in Atlantic City, or are you going to do this out in the sticks in the middle of New Jersey? Now, if it were me, it's a cultivation facility. Granted, your micro business license, you're limited in operating within the municipality that you live in or directly are adjacent to, so that does limit your range. But, if you can buy a parcel, build a building, and build it out 2,500 square foot, I would say $1 million is actually pretty accurate. You could do this for cheaper, but you're going to get a lower yield because you're installing less equipment. Like say you just wanted to do a single tier of cultivation, HPS lighting over trays, that's going to cause your build out to be almost, half of what I would do if I were to try and do vertical farming and stack that 2,500 square foot space out with as many plants as possible. Only LEDs are going to get you that vertical farming, right? LEDs are $1,200 to $1,500 per fixture. So you're talking about a $300 HPS light versus a $1,200 LED light, and then twice as many of them because you're stacking your farming units, right? So ultimately, the answer to that question is, how big do you want to go initially? How much capital can you raise? I could see a 2,500 square foot indoor cultivation facility being done as cheaply as 700,000, but that's going to be a much lower yield of just HPS lighting over a single row of trays, right? If you wanted to try and double that, you could go vertical, but you're spending, you know, twice as many lights that are 3 times as expensive. So I'll leave that to the audience to do that math. But yeah, it's just one of those things where I would say 1 million to 1.2 is absolutely feasible. You could probably pay it off by the end of your first year, and then hopefully by the end of 24 months you can expand. There's also potential to sell clones and to help other cultivators with nurseries. So just on the point of diversifying, you're not just potentially selling flowers, you could also be helping other cultivators in state try to get their farm up and running, because especially in that initial phase, genetics and access to plants is going to be one of the biggest pinch points. So there's some startup input for you.
Well, thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate it. Warren, thank you very much. I always enjoy talking with you. It's always a pleasure when we're able to get together. And so thank you so much for doing this, and really enjoyed sitting and talking with you this morning.
The feeling's mutual, Chris, and I'm really hoping that you know, coming up here we'll get another one of these going for like manufacturing and sort of continue the conversation, you know, through the industry, because like you said, the manufacturing really is it's a lot more moving parts even than the cultivation, and it can be pretty sticky. I see that that's one of the areas with the biggest deficits of knowledge in the industry. So yeah, always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to keeping this conversation going with HBK and your team.
Awesome, thank you. All right, well,